Welcome back, everyone. Today we're diving into a world where home, well, it's not just four walls, it's a whole way of life, and a way of life that's under threat.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
We're going back to the mid-1990s, going to explore indigenous land rights and all the struggles that came with that, using this incredible resource from the IWGIA, the Indigenous World, 1995-1996.
Fascinating period.
It is. It's like almost like a time capsule, you know? Reports from researchers all over the world.
And this is key.
Yeah.
You have actual indigenous voices in here speaking about what they were dealing with.
Exactly. It makes it so much more powerful, like you're hearing it straight from the source.
No sugarcoating.
Right. So what kind of picture does it paint? Well, honestly, it's a real mixed bag.
Some good, some bad, yeah.
Some regions, things were looking up. There was progress happening. The Arctic, parts of South America, even Australia saw indigenous rights starting to gain some real traction.
Like new laws being put in place, land settlements, a sense that maybe, just maybe, the tide was turning.
Exactly. And this was around the same time the wheels were in motion for Nunavut in Canada, which would become a reality just a few years later in 1999.
Huge moment for the Inuit, going way beyond just land.
Absolutely, it was about self-determination.
Right, controlling their own affairs, governing themselves, and over in Australia you had those big reports on social justice, and guess what? They were led by Indigenous people directly.
Wow, so their voices were actually shaping the national conversation.
They were essential.
So that's the good news. But then you look at other parts of the world.
It gets darker, yeah.
Yeah, parts of Asia, like
Right.
Nagaland, East Timor. The report details some really, really disturbing stuff. I mean, we're talking about human rights violations.
And it's that same demand for self-determination, but this time,
It's met with violence.
repression, the exact opposite of progress.
It really highlights how different the situation was depending on where you were in the world.
And it's important to remember, all this is happening while the environment's being absolutely trashed.
Oh, totally. It's like these two things, the fight for land and the fight against environmental destruction, they're completely intertwined.
Woven together, yeah.
And there's this one story, it's actually a tragedy, but it really captures this. It's about the Ogoni people in Nigeria and their leader, Ken Saro-Wiwa.
Powerful figure.
Yeah, they were protesting against Shell, the oil company.
Right, their oil extraction practices were devastating the Ogoni's environment.
Like totally destroying it.
Yeah.
And what did the Nigerian government do? Brutal crackdown.
1995, they hang Saro-Wiwa and 8 other activists with him.
I mean, talk about silencing a voice.
It sent shockwaves, not just for indigenous rights, but environmental justice, too.
Makes you realize the stakes,
Yeah.
what people are up against.
And sadly, the Ogoni weren't alone.
No, not at all.
The report details similar threats from oil exploration in Colombia to the Yuwa people, and in Peru, too, indigenous communities were feeling the pressure.
All because someone wants to make a profit off oil. It's infuriating.
But here's the inspiring part. Indigenous communities weren't just sitting back and taking it. They were fighting back.
Oh, yeah, they were getting creative, too.
Desperate times, desperate measures.
I mean, imagine being so pushed to the limit that you start burning company property. That's what the Dayak communities in Kalimantan, Indonesia did to try and stop industrial tree planting on their ancestral lands.
Powerful symbol.
It really is. And you see this same spirit of resistance in Sabah, Malaysia, too.
Indigenous communities there were pushing back against losing their land to logging, all these plantations popping up.
It's like everywhere you look, there's this fight happening.
Over and over, and sometimes it gets even more complicated. Like in Tanzania, you had the Maasai.
They were being evicted from their traditional lands. And get this, in the name of conservation.
Yeah, you really got to wonder who's actually benefiting from that.
Right. Makes you question the whole thing.
Whose conservation? Whose land? It's not just about trees, it's about entire ways of life.
And that's perfectly illustrated by the Van Gujars in Uttar Pradesh, India. They were facing eviction from their forest, but instead of giving up,
They came up with a solution.
yeah, this incredible plan for community forest management.
Like they were going to run the whole thing.
They even pitched it as a model for India's first People's National Park.
Talk about flipping the script.
It's so inspiring, showing what self-determination actually looks like.
But let's be real, these victories were hard fought. They didn't come easy.
Oh, absolutely not. There were some powerful forces trying to keep things the way they were.
Which brings us to something crucial here. Land ownership and how the whole system is set up.
Yeah, it's like so often the legal frameworks, they were just used to justify taking away land from indigenous communities.
Exactly. And these frameworks were created without any input from them.
It's like they weren't even at the table.
invisible.
And a perfect example of this is Greenland. The report goes into the establishment of the Greenland Minerals Office. Sounds kind of boring, right?
Not exactly thrilling, but...
But it's a great example of how things can get complicated really fast.
So on the surface, it's about economic development.
Bringing in mining and oil companies, creating jobs, all that.
But then, if you look closer...
You start asking some tough questions, like what does this mean for Indigenous rights? Where's the environmental protection in all of this?
Is it even possible to balance those things, or is this just another form of exploitation?
Right, and then there's the historical baggage that gets piled on top of all of this.
Layers upon layers.
The report goes into this really controversial thing that happened back in 1953. Chinook families were relocated to make way for U.S. Air Force installations.
Forced relocation.
And decades later, people are still hurting from that, especially because...
The government refused to apologize for it.
I mean, come on.
It just adds insult to injury, you know? Like their cane doesn't matter.
Exactly. The prime example of the power dynamics at play. Who gets to decide what, who gets listened to.
And that historical trauma, it's essential to understanding these struggles.
It's not just about what's happening in the present. It's about generations of this stuff.
Generations of dispossession, the fight to be recognized, to have those wrongs acknowledged.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit, head over to Russia, because things there were just as messy, maybe even more so.
Definitely some parallels.
Yeah, this example from Western Siberia really stood out to me. In 1991, land was returned to indigenous communities. Sounds great, right?
Like a victory.
Exactly. But then guess what? Almost immediately, it gets taken away again for industrial activities.
Wait, so they gave it back and then took it away again?
Yep, talk about a cycle of hope and betrayal.
It's heartbreaking.
And it shows how fragile those so-called legal protections can be when you've got powerful economic interests pushing in the other direction.
Sadly, this is a theme we see all over the world.
And then you have the Sami people on the Kola Peninsula. They add another layer to this whole thing.
They were in the midst of this cultural revival.
Really?
Yeah, rediscovering their language, their traditions, their art.
That's amazing, like a culture coming back to life.
But then they wanted to create a Sami parliament, have a real say in their own future.
What happened?
Resistance, pushback. It shows the limits of just cultural recognition, you know? Like you can sing your songs, but don't you dare try and make your own laws.
That's like saying, we'll tolerate your existence, but we won't give you any real power.
Exactly. And these different case studies, they're like puzzle pieces, helping us see this much bigger picture of what indigenous people were up against.
Yeah, the report doesn't stop there. It goes deep into how all these same things were happening in the Americas, too.
We're from Canada all the way down to South America.
The Lubicon Cree in Canada fighting against oil and gas development, the Western Shoshone in the U.S. dealing with decades of nuclear testing on their land.
It's the same pattern, playing out again and again.
And then you have the story of Leonard Peltier, a Native American activist who ended up in prison for the deaths of 2 FBI agents.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, really complicated case. Raises some serious questions about how indigenous rights were treated within the U.S. legal system.
Some people believe he was wrongfully convicted.
Even calling for his release.
It became this international symbol, you know, showing that indigenous rights weren't just a local issue, they were a global human rights concern.
And speaking of global concerns, the report takes us to Guatemala, too, where the indigenous Mayan population was facing all this discrimination from the dominant Ladino culture.
It reminds us that this isn't just about land, it's about cultural survival, the right to just exist on your own terms.
Without being assimilated, erased.
Exactly.
But amidst all of this, all these challenges, there were these glimmers of hope, too.
Always.
Like the election of a quiche mayor in Quetzaltenango.
Wow, that's significant.
It really was. It showed that indigenous communities could gain political power, make change from within the system.
So it wasn't all doom and gloom.
No, not at all. There were definitely some bright spots. But it makes you wonder, what role were international organizations playing in all of this? What about advocacy efforts? Were they helping to turn the tide?
Well, just looked at the IWGIA report itself. The fact that it exists is huge.
Right.
It means someone was paying attention, documenting these issues, bringing them to light.
Like shining a spotlight on what was happening?
Exactly. And they weren't just relying on outsiders either.
What do you mean?
The report actually talks about their efforts to get more Indigenous representatives involved in the Indigenous world.
Oh, wow. So they were actively trying to make sure those voices were heard.
Because real change can't happen unless you're listening to the people most affected.
Partnering with them, not speaking for them.
Right. And this period, the mid-90s, it was a turning point in a lot of ways.
You really see that in the report.
This growing recognition of Indigenous rights on the world stage, culminating in the drafting of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
It's
Landmark achievement, for sure.
a potential blueprint for a better future.
But the report is very clear about this. This was just the beginning.
Defining and implementing those rights, that's a whole other battle.
Oh, absolutely. It's way more complicated than just words on paper.
Because concepts like participation and self-determination, well, they can mean different things to different people.
And that's the challenge, making sure those words translate into real change on the ground.
It needs constant attention, people pushing for it.
And that's what's so inspiring about this report.
What do you mean?
It's full of examples of Indigenous communities taking action, showing incredible resilience.
Yeah, like they weren't just victims, they were driving change.
They were leading the way.
One of the most powerful examples of this is from the Arctic, actually.
Oh, yeah.
The report talks about how the Inuit, through the Inuit Circumpolar Conference, were advocating for greater control over their traditional lands and resources.
Makes sense, especially with all the interest in oil and mineral development up there.
Exactly. And their advocacy went beyond just Canada.
They were thinking bigger.
Yeah, they understood the power of international collaboration.
Indigenous groups from different countries coming together saying, we're in this fight together.
And that same spirit was popping up in other regions too, like South America.
Right. The report highlights IWGIA, the coordinating body of Indigenous organizations of the Amazon basin.
What a mouthful.
I know, right? But they were doing some incredible work bringing together Indigenous groups from all over the Amazon to tackle these huge challenges like deforestation and land grabbing.
That's amazing. It really highlights how these struggles go beyond borders.
It's a global fight, needing global solutions.
And their work wasn't just about advocacy either.
They're coming up with solutions too.
Like what?
The report mentions projects focused on sustainable development, language preservation, even cultural revitalization.
Wow, so they were thinking holistically.
It was a whole package, a vision for a better future.
And they were using their own knowledge, their own traditions to do it.
Exactly. It flips the script on its head, you know?
Oh, so?
This idea that Indigenous communities are somehow obstacles to development, when they're actually essential partners in conservation, environmental protection.
They've been stewards of their lands for centuries.
They hold the knowledge we desperately need to solve all this environmental mess we're in.
Maybe it's time we actually started listening to them.
About time.
And it seemed like the world was starting to catch on, at least a little.
How so?
The report mentions this growing recognition of Indigenous rights within the United Nations.
Okay, that's promising.
We're talking resolutions, declarations, acknowledging their unique status, calling for greater protection of their lands, cultures, and ways of life.
Feels like a step in the right direction.
It does, but as always, the report kind of brings us back down to earth.
What do you mean?
Bridging the gap between those fancy declarations and what's actually happening. That's the real challenge.
It's the implementation that matters.
Because even with all those good intentions, Indigenous communities are still facing discrimination, land dispossession, environmental destruction.
It's a reminder that this fight is about more than just words.
It's about changing the power structures, shifting the narrative, amplifying those voices that have been silenced for so long.
And creating a world where Indigenous rights aren't just recognized, but actually live.
Where their cultures can thrive, not just survive.
And we all have a role to play in that.
So as we move forward from this deep dive, I think it's time for some serious self-reflection.
Absolutely.
What questions should we be asking ourselves about the state of Indigenous rights today? Like, how has the landscape changed since the mid-90s?
Have we seen real progress on these issues? Land dispossession, environmental degradation, all of it.
Or are these challenges just evolving, taking on new forms in the 21st century?
And how is globalization, technology, all that impacting Indigenous communities?
Is it creating new opportunities or making things worse?
And finally, how can we be better allies in this fight?
How can we support their self-determination? Help create a world where their rights are truly respected, where their cultures can flourish?
These are the questions we need to grapple with.
And the answers. They don't lie in some theory or political speech.
They lie in the lived experiences, the wisdom, the voices of Indigenous peoples themselves.
It's on us to listen, to learn, and to act in solidarity.
It's about understanding, that real change has to come from listening to the people who are actually affected.
Not just talking about them, but with them.
Yeah, partnering with them instead of speaking for them.
And this period, the mid-90s, it really felt like a turning point.
Oh, definitely. Things were shifting.
You see this growing recognition of Indigenous rights on the world stage.
Like it was becoming part of the conversation.
Exactly. And that led to, well, it culminated in the drafting of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Huge moment.
Landmark achievement.
A potential blueprint for actually making things different.
But the report makes it clear this was just the start.
Oh, yeah, the hard work was just beginning.
Because defining those rights and then actually putting them into practice.
Yeah, implementation, that's the real challenge.
It's so much more complicated than just words on paper.
It is, because you've got these concepts like participation and self-determination.
And they can mean different things to different people.
Exactly. So how do you make sure those words translate into real change, real action on the ground?
It's a constant battle.
It needs constant attention, people pushing to make it happen.
And that's what's so amazing about this report.
What do you mean?
It's not just about the problems. It's filled with examples of Indigenous communities taking charge.
Fighting back.
Showing incredible resilience, resourcefulness. They weren't just sitting around waiting for someone to save them.
They were leading the way.
One of the most striking examples comes from the Arctic, actually.
Really? Tell me more.
The report talks about how the Inuit, through the Inuit Circumpolar Conference, were pushing for more control over their lands and resources.
Smart move, especially with all that interest in oil and minerals up there.
And their advocacy, it went beyond just Canada.
They were thinking big.
Exactly. They saw the power of collaborating with other Indigenous groups.
Crossing borders, joining forces.
Yeah, Indigenous groups from all over saying, hey, we're all in this together.
Powerful message.
And that same energy was happening in South America, too.
Right. The report highlights IWGIA, the coordinating body of Indigenous organizations of the Amazon basin.
The mouthful, I know.
It is, but they were doing important work, connecting Indigenous groups across the entire Amazon.
Wow, that's ambitious.
They had to be. They were tackling some massive challenges. Deforestation, land grabbing, you name it.
And it just shows, again, how these struggles go beyond borders.
Global problems, needing global solutions.
In IWGIA, they weren't just about talking either.
No, they were about action.
They were coming up with actual solutions.
Developing projects focused on sustainable development, cultural revitalization, even language preservation.
Wow. So they were really thinking long-term.
It was this holistic approach, a vision for a better future.
And they were using their own knowledge, their own traditions to make it happen.
Which flips the script, doesn't it?
How so?
This idea that Indigenous communities are somehow standing in the way of progress, when in reality, they're essential for protecting the environment, for real sustainability.
They've been stewards of their lands for centuries.
They have so much knowledge to share, knowledge that we desperately need.
So maybe it's time we actually started listening.
It's long overdue.
And it seemed like, at least a little bit, the world was starting to catch on.
What makes you say that?
The report mentions this growing recognition of Indigenous rights within the United Nations.
Okay, that's good news.
Yeah, they were passing resolutions, issuing declarations, acknowledging the unique status of Indigenous peoples, calling for their lands and cultures to be protected.
A definite step in the right direction.
It felt like progress. But as always, the report brings us back down to earth.
What do you mean?
There's this huge gap between those nice words and the reality on the ground.
Yeah, declarations are one thing, but actually making them a reality.
That is the challenge.
It's about action, not just words.
Because Indigenous communities were still dealing with discrimination, their land being taken away, the environment being destroyed.
And often it was at the hands of the very governments and corporations claiming to care about human rights.
It's a huge contradiction.
It is, and it shows that this fight goes way beyond just legal documents.
It's about challenging those in power, changing the whole narrative.
Amplifying the voices that have been silenced for far too long.
Creating a world where Indigenous rights aren't just something on paper.
Where they're actually lived, experienced.
Where their cultures can not just survive, but thrive.
And that's something we all have a responsibility to work towards.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's time for some self-reflection.
What do you mean?
What questions should we be asking ourselves about the state of Indigenous rights today?
good question. Where do we even begin?
Well, for starters, how has the landscape of indigenous struggles changed since the mid-90s? Have we seen real progress on issues like land dispossession, environmental degradation, and cultural suppression?
Or have those challenges just morphed, taken on new forms in the 21st century?
We also have to consider how things like globalization and technology are impacting indigenous communities. Are they helping or hurting?
Right. Are they opening up new opportunities or just exacerbating existing inequalities?
And most importantly, how can we be better allies in this fight? How can we support indigenous self-determination and help create a world where their rights are genuinely respected and their cultures can flourish?
These are tough questions, but they're the right ones to be asking.
And the answers, they're not going to be found in some textbook or political speech.
They're out there in the lived experiences, the ancestral knowledge, the voices of indigenous peoples themselves.
All we got to do is listen, learn, and act. It's about recognizing that indigenous rights aren't something that someone can just, grant.
It's not a gift,
Exactly. They're inherent, like fundamental to what a just world actually looks like.
which means we need a pretty big shift in perspective,
Oh yeah, how we see things, our relationship with the land, with each other.
Even how we define development.
Yeah, like moving away from that mindset of just taking.
The kind that prioritizes profit above everything else.
People, the planet, all of it.
Exactly. We need a different model.
Something sustainable, regenerative, something that puts indigenous knowledge front and center.
This deep dive into the mid-90s, it's not just about looking back,
No, it's about understanding where we are now, how we got here.
and where we need to go.
Exactly. These stories, the struggles, the resilience, the hope.
They hold so many lessons for us.
For the challenges we're facing today, climate change, injustice, the loss of biodiversity, all of it.
The report's very clear about this. International solidarity, that's key.
Yeah, it's not just about individual communities, it's about collective action.
Indigenous groups coming together, sharing knowledge, strategies, resources.
And it's a reminder that we all have a responsibility here.
To stand with indigenous peoples, amplify their voices, support their self-determination.
It's not just about them, it's about all of us.
So as we wrap up, let's leave our listener with something to think about.
Okay, what do you got?
What can we learn from these communities? Their wisdom, their resilience, their sheer determination.
It's incredible, isn't it?
It really is. So how do we apply those lessons to our own lives?
Our communities, our efforts to build a better world.
A world that's more just, more equitable, a world that's actually sustainable.
Big questions.
And the answers, well, they're not going to be found in some theory or politician's speech.
They're out there in the lived experiences, the knowledge that's been passed down for generations.
The voices of indigenous peoples themselves.
So let's listen to those voices, learn from them, and act in solidarity, because that's how we make real change.